now we'll kind of move on. Tamara and I, we picked out a couple of topics that we want to discuss. And like I said, we're both in California, but this is kind of going to be in general. And these are some of the biggest issues we see men face. So the first question, the first topic we'll move into is domestic violence. So I always give the disclaimer that any domestic violence is too much domestic violence, and both men and women should not be, whether it be any form of domestic violence, not just the physical, it shouldn't be occurring. But what we find is a lot of times you get in the heat of a divorce or a child custody matter, and all of a sudden, despite the fact 11-year relationship with no problems on the outside, one of the parties alleges the other person was seriously physically violent, substance abuse. So when a client comes to you and says, and comes in, hey, they have a temporary restraining order out on them, and they're like, I didn't do any of this, there's no evidence of this. What are the steps you take to protect them moving forward in that proceeding?
Okay, so first thing about the educational piece with the client, and I want to send out a public service announcement right now. The law has evolved to a point where domestic violence can be repetitive phone calls. Domestic violence can be coercive control, isolating someone from the family bank accounts, cutting off credit cards so that they can't leave, finding out where the woman's shelter is and showing up. Coercive control, okay? It can be emotional and psychological. A lot of things are happening just in human behavior right now. So, in the last 2 years in the pandemic, we've seen a deterioration in a lot of relationships, right? Kids aren't going to school. Teachers aren't reporting issues of abuse to DCFS. Um, parents, married parents are fighting, right? Unmarried parents are fighting. People are under an enormous amount of stress because of these large factors in society, right? Losing your job, facing an eviction, dealing with sickness, not having health insurance, or maybe dealing with any combination of those factors with health insurance and with a job. But the point is, Mark, we're seeing a breakdown, right, in relationships. And there has been a sharp increase in domestic violence. Ask any 911 operator, right? Um, ask people in the emergency room. You're also seeing murders and homicides go up. So you're seeing that, from the extreme aspects where just people already prone to violence, just, ramping up. But you're also seeing a unique category of conflict, and that is people who would otherwise be getting along, going to school, going to work, coming back home, functioning in their relationships, who are not prone to violence, not violent people, have no propensity, no background for violence, and they're getting accused of domestic violence. And those temporary restraining orders, listen, courts are extremely sensitive to the fact that they're being misused to circumvent a regularly noticed custody action, right? But on the other hand, you have to be aware of the kinds of behavior that can trip you up. So one of the first things you have to do when you as a person are in the court system is you've got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. And what that might mean is, what am I saying on social media and how could that be perceived by the other parent? I won a whole case just on social media postings, and they were basically veiled threats to the other parent. Okay. What am I saying in my text messages to this parent? How often am I calling? Now, if you're cursing at a parent, red flag, right? Because now you're in the space of a temporary order could be issued against you. And it sounds bizarre, right? Because people do it all the time. They cuss each other out, right? But in the context of the public policy of these domestic violence statutes, the temporary orders are just to prevent the escalation of violence, to give people a stopping point. so that it doesn't end up in someone being violently hurt, or worse yet, a child getting hurt in conflicts. So we're seeing people who are like, normally peaceful and functioning, catching a case. And that is a real public policy problem, and we're dealing with it. Like our phones are ringing, the courts are flooded, people are starting to get back into court and doing their filings. And Mark, one of the first things I screen for is, you know, what are the types of allegations? Because if you're in the land of these people are under extraordinary stress, they just need to break up, have a cooling off period, and then reestablish civil, respectful boundaries, then maybe what we should just do is have a temporary order in place, but continue to go into court to modify and increase visitation and physical custody until we achieve parity, right?
Yeah.
Like it was before we started dealing with COVID and job loss and all these factors. So a lot of times it's just about really advocating for your client, like telling the court that, the relationship with the child is so solid. We should just keep these two apart, but not penalize the parent, or worse yet, punish the child and have them suffer the loss of the relationship. But it's very dangerous times, and people have got to be extremely careful what they're saying, what they're posting, what they're doing, and how they're treating the other parent to their child, because you can catch a case right now, as I don't want to say by looking at the other person the wrong way, because that would be overstating the case, but for things that you just would otherwise not be doing, were you not under so much social, emotional, psychological, and economic stress. So these are things we have to consider as advocates.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point. I had a few weeks ago Dr. Robert Simon, who is one of the foremost, we'll call it foremost experts and expert witnesses in the space, and he talked about that. He testifies a lot that of these domestic incidents, and I'll touch on that because I have my opinion on those as well. But he takes a look at it, and he looks at it and he'll tell a judge, okay, based on this may fit the definition of domestic violence. I call it, like, you have the mean text domestic violence restraining orders. Um, Reality. I've
Yep.
had guys come to me and it's literally based on, some of them aren't even mean text, but they shouldn't have been sending the texts.
Sure.
And
I see a lot of that.
yeah. And he explained it. He's like, I want to explain to the judge of, okay, this was domestic violence in definition, but the only reason it happened was because this relationship was deteriorating, and there's zero risk of domestic violence moving forward. And the public in general doesn't understand what a domestic violence restraining order is, and it can create this stigma around this person that has very, very detrimental impact on their personal and professional lives. So I think that's one thing that I took from a couple weeks ago from the interview. It's in terms of educating the judge, telling them, hey, I mean, this was something, this couple obviously doesn't get along. There's a reason why after 10 years of marriage, they're getting a divorce. There's a reason after 3 years of dating and 2 kids, they're separating and we're in this spot for child custody. There's no risk moving forward, but there needs to be that cooling off period.
Right. And so ideally you want, if you did something that, technically trips you up with the court, you might consider doing exactly what you said. So distilled, you take responsibility, you change the narrative, you create a path forward. But it's an extremely useful technique, right? To work with the other side to extend the stay away orders, meaning we're not going to talk, but change the custody visitation orders to create a path forward. Because so long as that temporary order expires, you don't have the severe repercussions that really work against both parties. So a lot of times a mom will have a restraining order, right? And it goes into a permanent restraining order, and they didn't realize that person could lose their job because that other father is a civil servant, right? And now can't pass a DOJ background check. Or that other person is a teacher or a firefighter or a policeman, right? And it cuts directly in an opposite direction against the need for support. Because if that other person loses their economic viability, you know, gets terminated, worse yet, can't find a job, can't re-enter into their market, guess what that means for child support?
Yep. Not going to be as much money to go around for either party.
There you go. And that's one of those things that could really threaten the well-being of a child. So be careful the swords you throw. And if one is thrown at you, you have some shields. And those are proposals, even if the other side didn't agree, where if you have someone great like Mark who's showing up in the court fighting with you for you tooth and nail, they're going to tell the court, look, we're going to extend out the stay away order, give them a cooling off period. But what we're not going to do is cut off the father from the child, because
Yeah.
this child is going to be destroyed from that. And just because they're fighting doesn't mean the child shouldn't have a chance to be a healthy, whole, productive human being. And we know statistically that the outcomes of children who don't have two involved parents, it's something worth looking at and considering from both sides, from the perspective of both mothers and fathers. Because what are you really after? Did you win the battle and then lose the war? Because one of the fact patterns that I think is really interesting is when mothers get early victories while the child is really young and saddled on the mother's chest, and very codependent on the physical needs and affection of the mother because they were just born, right? But then long term, right, they're wondering why this child is now a teenager and acting out, can't get control of the child. And they're wondering why they're calling this father that they successfully isolated from the child's life, right? And they're not getting much involvement. I see a fact pattern where it starts to dawn on the parent, what's happening to my child? Why are they dysfunctioning? And I submit, well, maybe not having a father psychically, emotionally, maybe when you see kids having mental health crises, acting up, fighting in school, abusing drugs and alcohol and sex, dropping out, you know, maybe there's a connection there, you think?
I think we got about 20 years of social science now that says that's unequivocally a fact.
Boom.